Hello and welcome to the Camera Rolling Podcast. I'm your host Ronnie and this is episode 24. So today's episode is going to be a little more serious than my previous episodes, and it's not going to be as focused on film as previous episodes, but this is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, and because these things are happening at the same time, I think it's extremely important to talk about them. And I want to talk about each of the topics that I will be bringing up today, and then sort of talk about why I have brought them all together to be in the same episode, in the same video. Also, before I get into the topics today, I wanted to mention that I continually miss the day that I want to have a video done or have an episode done. So I'm not sure if I'm going to move the days of the episodes around a little bit. Instead of doing Mondays, maybe I'll have them released on Tuesdays instead now, just to make it a little bit easier for myself because my schedule has changed in a weird way. So yeah, that's possible, but again, not going to make any promises. I'm not going to say anything is absolute, but I just wanted to mention that. But today I'm going to be talking about Ruby Franke, the Quiet on Set series, and Jojo Siwa. So to start off, let's talk about Ruby Franke. If you are unfamiliar with who she is, she's a 42-year-old family vlogger and mother to 6 children, and she ran the 8 Passengers channel. And of course it's called 8 Passengers because she has 6 children, and then her and her husband were the 2 adults. And their channel here on YouTube by 2020 had amassed over 2.5 million subscribers, pretty much through sharing the lives of her children 5 days a week for roughly 5 years, so since about 2015. Her content was mostly what every family vlogger does, where they document their children's lives. And of course, now that we know more of what goes on behind the scenes of a lot of family vloggers, I think a lot of people have mixed opinions about vlogging in general, and literally showing your children's faces on the internet for other people to consume, no matter who that person is obviously kind of a tricky area, tricky line to walk if you are a parent who wants to share their parenting experience or their experience being a new parent, etc., because that was another element of her vlogs, was that she would share sort of her parenting style, her thoughts on parenting, and what exactly her parenting style looked like. And for many years, I think people really just enjoy the content. However, in recent years, people had begun to see some worrying things. They were especially worried about her children when she shared some kind of alarming parenting decisions. One of these decisions being that she would often withhold food from some of her children, or another was taking away the Christmas gifts that they'd had for that year because a sibling played a prank on another sibling. And to sort of specify here, in terms of withholding food from her children, it was not something that could be misread like withholding cookies from a child until they finish their dinner or before dinner or something like that. Most parents usually come to a point in their parenting where they have to say, no, you can't have cookies all of the time. You have to eat your vegetables because they have nutrients that cookies don't, right? Most parents will come across that situation at one point. This was genuinely withholding food, whether it was not allowing their child to eat food, or in one particular case that I remember that came up, that one of her children in elementary school forgot to pack a lunch for herself, and so the teacher of course called and said, your child does not have lunch, could you bring them a lunch? And she refused to. And I think people were really concerned and put off by this because she essentially defended her decision by saying that it's not her job, that she's in charge of making her own lunch in the morning, so it's her responsibility to do that. Granted, the child was probably between 6 and 9 at the time. I can't remember how old the child was, but a very young child, a child that would not remember to bring their lunch every single day in the hustle and bustle of getting ready for school in the morning, right? And it's very concerning to see somebody not really care what happens to their child, especially in regard to how she proposed that her daughter better understand it by not letting other children give her food, or telling them not to give her food in order for her to learn. Like, that's not usually how children learn things, and I think most teachers would agree that that's not usually how children learn things, but it is how children get traumatized. And so a lot of people were worried. Not only that, but when it came to withholding the Christmas gifts, I will say, for one, that they are Mormon. This comes into play in terms of the religious aspects that are very prevalent later on. However, I want to mention that them being Mormon doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, like, they're not equivalent of what she does later to Mormonism. I know lots of Mormons, super nice people, pretty chill people. Yes, there are some, like, fundamentalist type of Mormons, but for the most part, it really only comes into play in that you should know that Ruby Franke and her family are religious in some capacity. That's the religion they happen to follow at the beginning. However, as I get further into this, you'll find that that's not really the religion that they necessarily follow by the end. I just realized that I misspoke earlier about the Christmas gifts. She didn't take them away because of a prank. That's related to something else. But she did withhold the presents because they weren't responding the way that she wanted them to another punishment. So she had punished them for something else, and because the children didn't respond how she wanted to, I'm guessing they didn't respond with enough pain and agony, she decided to take away their Christmas gifts because that was something much larger. And again, if the kids had done something that was, like, morally and ethically objectionable by anyone's standards, like, something just absolutely heinous, it would make sense to take away their presents, right? Because most people know that, like, children love presents, and it's a very big deal to take them away from them. So, like, you better have a big ol' reason to take away those gifts, right? Needless to say, it felt a little out of left field, but one of the most worrying instances of parenting style that was exhibited by Ruby Franke was when the audience found out that one of her children had been without a bed for 7 months and was essentially sleeping on a beanbag chair. Now, it's one thing to be in a household of many, many children and to not be able to make ends meet, right? And so maybe a kid does have to sleep on the couch or on a beanbag chair, or, sleep in a twin bed with their other siblings just because you just don't have enough room. That's something that happens. It doesn't make you a bad parent if that does happen, because as long as you're trying to get everybody somewhere safe and comfortable to sleep, you're doing what you need to do. This was not that. He was sleeping on a beanbag chair for 7 months because he'd played a harmless prank on a sibling. And after playing this harmless prank, he was sent to, like, a teen wilderness camp. And after that, he was not allotted this bed. And you may be wondering, what prank could you play on somebody as a child that would get you in so much trouble that you would be sent to a camp to help fix your, like, behavior, a camp essentially for teens with behavioral problems, and also get your bed taken away from you? If you thought it was telling your younger sibling you were going to Disneyland or Disney World and you're not actually doing that, then I guess technically you'd be right if that's what you guessed, because that is the prank that he played on his sibling. He told them they were going to Disneyland or World, I can't remember. They're all the same, you know what I mean? But that they were going on a vacation when they weren't. I don't know about anyone else, but that doesn't seem like a behavioral issue. It just kind of seems like, honestly, one of the least harmful things you could do as a kid to your younger sibling. I would consider my brother jumping out from behind walls just to scare me, just to give me a little jump scare, more harmful than that, right? Like, it's definitely not worth that sort of punishment. And besides the ethical issues that a lot of people have with sort of these teen wilderness behavioral camp type of places, because there is a lot of issues amongst that we could talk about, her specific punishment of not allowing somebody a bed is very, very concerning, because it's showing, and through these other punishments that we've seen, she desires to take away necessities for life that you should be providing for your children no matter what. There's like no universe where you should be taking those things away from your children at any given point, right? Because they need those things to survive and be comfortable, to be living in a safe environment. So with more of these worrying parenting decisions that were coming to light, people started to get worried. Fans started to get worried about the safety of the children. And so people started to report the family to authorities through trying to get a petition started, as well as welfare checks, i.e., asking authorities to go over and make sure that the welfare of the children was okay. And this is one of those things that makes it even more concerning, because as people started to raise these concerns and make more noise about the issues that they were having and noticing within her parenting style, her channel began to decline to the point that she decided to delete it in 2022. And this was also around the time that her and her husband separated. And this was like a literal separation, as in he moved out. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, like, what does that have to do with anything? Trust me, it comes back later. So around 2022, among this decline, as well as her deleting the 8 Passengers channel from YouTube, this was also sort of around the time that she met a woman named Jodi Hildebrandt. But in short, Jodi Hildebrandt is a mental health coach for the company Connections, spelled with an X instead of a T. And I put air quotes around a mental health coach, one, because it is concerning how many people consider themselves to be coaches of things. I'm not saying that being a coach is a bad thing, because I'm sure there are plenty of qualified and amazing coaches out there who maybe just didn't have the money or access to the education to get like professional qualifications. But honestly, when it comes to mental health, please trust the professionals. I know that lived experience can do a lot for you, but when we're talking about our brain, and we're talking about mental health, I want someone who knows both sides of it. Professionals consistently misdiagnose people. So I'm not saying professionals are everything, but I honestly don't really trust mental health coaches, or just anyone who considers them a coach of something if it's not a sport, because that's really where it should be. Needless to say, Jodi decided to mentor Ruby in her journey as both a parent and as a counselor / coach in this company. And this is also when they started making joint social media accounts like the Connections YouTube channel, where they would share their parenting beliefs and what they thought of how to parent. And this was equally as terrifying and concerning when they started posting these things, and people were rightly concerned about the welfare of the children. Not only that, but the eldest daughter, Sherry, ended up calling DCFS, or I can't remember what exactly they stand for, but they are essentially a child and family welfare sort of service, sort of like CPS, and there's different ones throughout different states, but essentially they are the government entity that helps to deal with family and children issues, right? But the oldest daughter, Sherry, who had moved out and gone to college at this point, decided to call authorities and open a case with the Department of Child and Family Services because she was unsure about anyone from the outside becoming aware that something was not right in the Franke home. And it's even more unfortunate to me because it took almost a year before one of the two youngest that was still living at home were able to escape from the home. And I mean that in the most literal sense of escape from the home, to run away to a neighbor to ask for help. And when they appeared on this neighbor's door, they were found to be extremely emaciated. And I use this word in particular because later, when they were talking to, the authorities were talking to Ruby Franke's husband about the children being emaciated, he had no idea what that word meant. I'm not saying that you're dumb if you don't know what that word means, but this is an adult man. It's a fairly common word, in my opinion. I think you would probably come across it in many high school books or required reading. So, needless to say, the child was emaciated and had clearly been tied with duct tape because he still had it around his, wrists and ankles. And obviously, Ruby was arrested, and subsequently, Jody was arrested. But they were, of course, arrested on child abuse charges, and that was pretty much based solely on how they found the two children at the home. Because not only was, the child who escaped completely emaciated, the girl, and they actually do have the body cam footage from the police who went to the Franke home. I can't remember if it was actually in Ruby Franke's home or Jody Hildenbrandt, just because they sort of went between multiple locations and had planned on even moving to a more isolated place with these children. So luckily, they hadn't been moved to a more isolated neighborhood before they were found. But like what I was saying before, when they found the young girl, in this footage you can see that she for one doesn't look like a little girl because she'd had her head shaved, which one of my references that I'm leaving is Stephanie Harlow, and for one, she's an amazing researcher. She makes amazing videos that are super in-depth, and she has multiple videos on Ruby Franke, both from the start of all of this, as well as through to now. And one of her more recent videos on Ruby Franke has to do with the body cam footage, as well as Ruby Franke's diary entries. Because for one, I don't think the woman was mentally well, but two, she talks about sort of why she had shaved her little girl's head. And I don't know. I personally wouldn't recommend watching the footage if you're sensitive to these topics. Pretty much it was discovered that the torture was incited by Ruby's extreme religious beliefs and the guidance that Jody lended to her for not even that long, it seems like, for maybe like a year or so, had Jody really been an influence on Ruby, which shows you just how deeply, how intensely her hold over people and how manipulative you have to be to convince people of this. And even more so, if you look into Jody Hildenbrandt, you'll see that she also had been committing very similar acts before this for many years. So it's unfortunate that it took this long for them to be apprehended, for Jody specifically to be apprehended. Needless to say, the situation is very unfortunate, and we're all hoping the worst for Ruby and Jody, both in prison and for their sentences. But But part of the reason that I bring up this situation is obviously, and maybe you noticed whenever I was talking through what I'll be talking about today, but there was a clear element of social media and the exploitation of her children. But it's really concerning to know that we saw some pretty crazy and unfortunate things as the audience of her YouTube channel that we can't imagine what horrifying things were going on behind the scenes besides through Ruby Franke's diary. And that sort of leads me to the next topic, which is Quiet on Set. So Quiet on Set is a mini docu-series directed by Mary Robertson and Emma Schwartz. It recounts the time that many child actors spent on the sets of Nickelodeon during the 90s and early 2000s. It currently has 5 episodes that talk about the environment created by Dan Schneider, along with the literal predators that were on set that were silently preying on these children behind the scenes. And this section will be a little bit shorter, mainly because you don't have to do a lot of research to sort of understand what's going on with Quiet on Set. Mainly because it is a docu-series, which means that there is some amount of access to it. If you don't have access to it, I'll just quickly summarize each of the episodes so you sort of understand what they're about. But episode 1 mainly covers Dan Schneider's personal rise to becoming this sort of budding producer of the series All That. If you're not familiar, All That is sort of a kids' version of SNL. It's comprised of skits that are acted out by actors who appear for the most part every week with, different guest stars and whatnot in front of a live audience. However, in this first episode, it mainly features interviews with the female writers that Dan Schneider pretty much harassed and drove out of the industry because of the environment that he created around him. And I thought that this episode was particularly interesting because a lot of the times, I think, as people, we tend to believe that if somebody has faced a certain hardship that makes them different from the sort of societal standards that we have for what people should be like or look like, we think that that person in the same amount of power might also be an ally, but it's very unfortunate that a lot of people just don't choose to be. And obviously, Dan Schneider's a straight white man. Okay, so he doesn't really have a lot to pull from, but he did grow up fat and he was bullied for it. And so you'd think that as someone who can recognize that they kind of have to be the funny person in order to hang out with the in crowd, that when he is around other people who are often oppressed, such as women, that he would want to protect them, be helpful, or stick up for them, but instead he did the complete opposite. He would harass them. He would literally sexually harass them, no matter who it was. It didn't matter if it was one of the writers. It didn't matter if it was one of the PAs, whomever. He would sexually harass them in various ways. And a lot of these men like this get away with it by not explicitly sexually harassing people like they do in those little videos that they make people watch now for workplace harassment, where they legitimately just come up and be like, I want to do you. Most of the time, sexual harassment is, give me a back rub. Oh, my shirt is showing. Oops. That sort of thing. It's a lot more subtle, and I think that's a lot of what Dan would do, even though he also would be very explicit, and part of it had to do with how much power he had, and the men around him would just go along with it. So, yeah, he created a very toxic work environment for women specifically that drove them away. The second episode features multiple cast members from All That speaking about their difficulties being a child star, with long work hours that definitely went beyond what we know to be child labor laws, the sort of strange environment that Dan Schneider created, because he did create a very strange environment not only in the way that he would implicitly try to harass people, but also in the skits themselves, in the writing themselves, because he was the one who was coming up with these inappropriate sketches and putting them through. Like, if somebody else were to have made that pitch to somebody else higher up, it never would have gotten greenlit. But because he was the one making those inappropriate jokes and then also the one who was going to greenlight them, that's what ended up happening. But not only that, they sort of talk about their relationship with their own identity as a star and a person. I think that we have seen this a lot in the past 20 and 30 years of seeing child stars sort of go along the pipeline to becoming people who are very mentally unwell. And it's one of those things where at the time, maybe we weren't as aware of it as we should have been. Like, a lot of people think about how people were making fun of, like, Britney Spears for having a meltdown or a breakdown in front of people when she very clearly, those were cries for help. And nobody was taking her serious. They were just exploiting it for views and whatnot. And it's unfortunate that, one, we still see that today, and two, that we couldn't take any notes from people like Judy Garland or Marilyn Monroe that were very clearly misunderstood, and we have the information to have not done that to other people, and yet media was media, and they still chose to exploit their mental health crises. Not only that, in the second episode, there's also sort of this mention of one of the parents, and I cannot remember who it is. I apologize. I'm not good with names, but they mention how they were uncomfortable with the amount of hours and sort of just the way that some of these sketches were in regard to their children. And when they tried to say anything, they would essentially get booted, right? And that is something that you don't want as an actor or or as a parent, especially in the industry. So a lot of the times they were either booted or just silenced. The third episode specifically focuses on Brian Peck. He was a dialogue coach that worked on many of the Nickelodeon sets, while also in his free time preying on Drake Bell. He violently abused Bell for many years, and it also sort of shows the process by which he was able to groom Belle to be abused. And I think sometimes people forget that the children who end up in these scenarios are not there because they have done anything wrong. They're not there because, they just weren't smart enough to see it. Like, there were a lot of people who tried to intervene in ways that were not able to truly be understood for what their intervention was. And the fourth episode is sort of a combination of the aftermath of Peck's sort of apprehension and the industry titans who just blindly supported him, as well as discussing more of Schneider's disturbing Nickelodeon content that ultimately led to his firing in 2018 during the Me Too movement, which, if you're unfamiliar, the Me Too movement was just a recognition of many abuse victims, more specifically like women, but really anyone who had been sexually abused or harassed or whatever the case was. Essentially, it was a gathering of many people putting in the me also, this also happened to me too, right? And the fifth episode is an interview with more of the All That cast talking more like as a collective. Needless to say, it was a very emotional and jarring sort of docu-series. And while I appreciate that they talked about it, and this is more on like a personal, like, film degree note, I felt that it was a little scattered in terms of the plot. There were just too many things trying to happen at the same time that I don't know if they really were able to focus in a way that made all of the pieces make sense together. I don't know. That's just my personal opinion. And finally, let's talk about Jojo Siwa. Jojo Siwa was born in 2003. She's a dancer and child star from Nebraska. Many know JoJo from her rise to fame that was heavily influenced by her time and relationship with Abby Lee Miller, the dance coach from Lifetime's show Dance Moms, and the other spin-offs that went along with that. JoJo's mother, Jessalyn, started JoJo's career as an entertainer as early as 2 years old by putting her in pageants. Geez, why did I say it like that? But she put her in pageants and started to attend dance classes. So by 2013, or by the time she was 10, JoJo was auditioning for Abby Lee on her spin-off show, Abby's Ultimate Dance Competition, where she was selected to be part of the main dance team on the show Dance Moms, which at that point had been airing for about 4 years, which will maybe become important later, depending on if I get back to that point. So JoJo was a part of the team for 2 seasons of the show, where she and her mother were pretty much portrayed as arrogant and loud, which I don't think is necessarily inaccurate, but we also know that like much of reality TV is just orchestrated by the producers to fit a certain narrative. So they were heavily villainized, but I don't think it was inaccurate that they are kind of arrogant and very loud people compared to everyone else on the show. Besides, Abby Lee. I'll also mention that JoJo is one of the few people who actually talks positively about her time on Dance Moms, which is one of those things where, again, the show had been on for about 4 years prior to, so she knew what she was getting into by being on the show, and she also only stayed for 2 seasons, which is a very short amount of time compared to the people who had very negative experiences overall, who had been on for multiple years. Like, any of the OGs had been on there for at least 4 years prior to and had dealt with the constant abuse for over 4 years, whereas the sort of abuse that JoJo would have faced on the show would have been much shorter lived. But before leaving the Dance Moms group, JoJo released her song Boomerang, which is actually coming up to like 1 billion views on YouTube, which is like crazy. But pretty much with her kid-friendly appearance and music career on the rise, she struck up a contract with Nickelodeon that helped put her face on like every kind of merch to exist. I mean, her rise was very quick because she was, again, very kid-friendly, and I think it's super ironic that she's kid-friendly, but she's like very, very tall, and very like big. Like, she just has a very big stature for like a 13 and 14-year-old or whatever at that time. But for the most part, you couldn't go into a Dollar General without seeing JoJo merch on a bow at the very least. So she's made quite a bit of money, right? She's definitely a millionaire. But her first shift in her image came in about 2021 when she came out as part of the LGBTQ community as a lesbian, and many parents of young children didn't really approve of her sexuality, even though at the time she was 17, so it's 17 or 18-ish, but she's enough of an adult to be able to do what she wants, and I don't think anyone, at least in the queer community, had any problem with that. Just another famous addition to the LGBTQ community. And I don't think there's anything wrong with her shifting a little bit of her image, especially in regard to if her sexuality is going to influence heavily how she navigates the world and how she is portraying herself, because like I personally don't think that everyone needs to share their sexuality all of the time, because it really doesn't make any difference to me unless it's like an integral part in like what you're doing. Like if you are making music and you're a woman singing about women, it would make sense that you would be like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm a lesbian, that's why I'm singing about women, right? Like it makes sense along with that. Whereas like if you're a basketball player, I don't care. Are you good at basketball or not, right? Needless to say, that was sort of her first major shift in image, but it wasn't so much a literal image shift. She did cut her hair a little bit shorter and her fashion sense changed slightly, but she still was wearing a lot of like bright colors, very like flashy, very outrageous sort of outfits, even though maybe there were some more muted colors like black and gray involved. The next note, I guess, to make in Jojo Siwa's history is that she spends a lot of time on the internet, thus she attracts a lot of internet drama. There was some drama around her pretending to be pregnant for a while. There was some drama around her and like ex-girlfriends and things like that. I don't think any of that has anything to do with anything. Just a teenager / young adult who doesn't realize that they don't need to share everything, but also shares everything because it makes them a lot of money. There was some drama surrounding JoJo in 2023 when she defended Colleen Ballinger. If you are unfamiliar with what Colleen Ballinger and much of her inner group was accused of, it's actually very similar to the Dan Schneider situations in which they were doing comedy and there were children who were in proximity to them that they did not protect, but instead maybe harmed in various ways. And multiple of their alleged victims, because I think that we're still having to say alleged, but multiple of their alleged victims have come forward to talk about their experience with them and afterwards about just sort of the environment that they cultivated in that space, and specifically Colleen Ballinger. And of course, she's back on the internet as if nothing happened. She like did a little ukulele apology and then went, anyway, my kids made these little things for Christmas or something like that. Then in 2024, which is now, allegations around toxic environments on her show Siwa's Dance Pop Revolution, a dance competition show, and the dance group that came from that. These pretty much were yet another allegation of sort of this cycle of abuse that continues to be perpetuated by a lot of literal like victims. Like, in my opinion, Jojo Siwa is also a victim, but it's really unfortunate to see the wheel keep turning in that regard, because Jojo Siwa had a dance competition show, and out of that came a little dance group. I believe it was called XOMG. I might be wrong on that, but some of them were talking about how there was a toxic work environment, how they were getting yelled at in a similar way to how we saw Abby Lee on Dance Moms. And of course, the most recent and probably least intense or serious drama that she's been in has to do with her recent music video and song called Karma, which is actually just a cover of a song that already existed. I don't know why these younger people think that, like, covering a song and, like, that they think the song is theirs when, like, it's not. I don't know. That's beside the point. This was supposed to be her debut, and sort of her transition into, like, I am an adult now, I sing more explicit lyrics and do more explicit choreography, and more adult themes will be involved, and you can see that in sort of, like, the music video and choreography in the music video, but also her style sort of shifted a little bit. It's still very loud, but more like in the way Kiss is loud, and not really in the same way that, like, bright colors are loud. But in an interview, she more or less said that she invented gay pop. And of course, people are very critical of her for that, because she, of course, did not. And this is not that new. Most who are active participants in the queer community know enough about queer history to know that she's not doing anything new or really that interesting, to be quite honest. But it does sort of leave me to question how delusional, or more so, like, how out of touch you have to be to think that you invented gay pop. And I think this all has to do with her circumstances. And this is what I wanted to talk about in full, because all three of these things separately are more or less concerning when it involves children in media, right? Whether it's Ruby Franke's children or the adults who were children back on the All That set, or if it's Jojo Siwa, who is barely an adult, right? All of these children had something to do with media and sort of their exploitation on certain platforms, whether it be the internet or in TV. And I think something that really bothered me when I encountered each of these stories was that where were the adults? Where were the people who are supposed to be protecting these people? What are they doing, and why are they not doing what they should be doing, right? Of course, when it comes to Ruby Franke, she is the problem, as well as Jody Hildenbrand. They were the ones who were supposed to be protecting them. And this is not a blame the victim sort of space, but I will mention that her husband should have and could have done something. Whether he was facing the abuse or not, along with the children, he still had the means to leave and get himself to safety, which means that he could have been telling the police, the authorities, to get in there and save those children, but he didn't. And that really bothers me, because he's an adult. And again, I'm not going to say that everything is his fault because he didn't do anything. It's just frustrating because he is an adult and he did have the means to do something and he didn't, and it just bothers me so much. And the other person that I sort of wonder about, and this is why I decided to go deeper into her story, was Sherry Franke, the eldest daughter. And in a podcast about her experience growing up in front of the camera all the time since about the age of 12, she sort of talks about, in this podcast episode, she sort of explains how she came to understand that being in front of the camera was like a job. And she understood from very early on that this job is what provided them all the niceties that they had, like going on vacation whenever they wanted to. And she also shared how she ended up having a very unhealthy relationship with social media because she was receiving so much direct feedback from strangers, literally as, a teenager and child, hearing people talk about her body, etc. I also thought that it was really interesting to hear her talk about her relationship with religion, being about mainly like fear-mongering and just the fear that she faced, and also sort of how she was witnessing her mother's descent into this religious life coaching cult that seems to be what Jody Hildebrand's connections really is. And she sort of explains in this podcast how going to college and escaping the bubble made her realize how messed up and negative her upbringing was, as well as like starting therapy also helped her have sort of this third party perspective on what was going on. And as much as I feel for her, it's very concerning to think that even though she did sort of call authorities to help, she never physically went in or returned to get those children out of there, knowing what she knew and was coming to understand about her own childhood and the way that her mother was getting deeper and deeper into this very extreme religion. And this is sort of a tangent, I guess, but I just thought it was so sad and unfortunate that when she was talking about her experiences growing up, she sort of talked about when she would cry and she would be alone, and that she found it comforting when she would think about God being there with her, like that she wasn't really alone crying. And all I could hear was, you experienced so much loneliness and isolation because you couldn't rely on your parents. You couldn't rely on anyone else to help you or comfort you or listen to you besides this entity, right? And that's really sad. And even when she talks about sort of being introverted as a kid, yet when she talks about being in college, how extroverted she sounds and how much she enjoys going out and being around people, that it's very clear that it wasn't so much that she was an introvert growing up, but that her mother was actively working to isolate her, and that she didn't think anything was wrong or that anything bad was happening because it's just the way things are, or that their parents convinced them that it's like a personality trait, when in reality it's just trauma that they are experiencing. And like I said before, Stephanie Harlow has a video where she sort of goes through Ruby Franke's journals, and it's very disturbing how she uses God and religion to sort of equate herself to God, and telling her children that God is all they need, so thus all they need is her, and she is trapping them under her control. It's very concerning. Again, I would heavily advise not to read them if that sort of thing like disturbs you. If hearing about children in trouble disturbs you, but knowing that Ruby Franke had sisters, i.e. the aunts, knowing that there were adult children who left, and again, we're not blaming the victim because clearly, like, her daughter is a victim, but knowing how many adults there were that could have helped these children before things got so bad, and that one little boy being strong enough to escape is what changed things, is so disturbing and so sad. And I think that children who are exposed to both this sort of abuse, but also to being on social media, to being the star of something, to equate being perceived with making money, is very concerning. The way that those things are equated for these children so early on, and the way that it's used against them, and the way that it's used to control them, specifically in the Ruby Franke case. And when you look at the Quiet Onset docu-series, you'll see how many of the stars felt like something was wrong, but they didn't really know what to say or how to speak up on it. And there were two people that stood out to me, which one of them was a parent who was like, I don't want my kid doing this weird stuff. I don't like the way that Dan Schneider is like treating these people. She genuinely had a problem with it, and she tried to help. And like most people know in the industry, if you cause rifts on set, you will get booted. And if you get booted off the set, then you either no longer have control over what happens to your child because you're no longer in their presence, or your child is booted off of the show and you no longer have that source of income. And a lot of the times what ends up happening, and this is sort of what happened with Drake Bell, is that it starts off as something that's completely innocent, but as they start to maneuver their way into your life and isolate you, they create an isolation by, waiting until this is now your only source of income because your parents had to give up everything to be on set every single day with you. So now you don't have school, you don't have any income, etc. besides this, so you can't afford to take the risk of saying this person is touching me behind the scenes, right? And so there's a way in which the TV and movie industry specifically exploits the children that are on sets and isolates them in a way by making it hard for them to jeopardize their role and their living, their source of income. And of course, I wanted to mention really quick, because I know there's a lot of differing opinions on Drake Bell and what he's done in the past few years. And all I'll say is that I feel like, for one, it's really sad that no one could tell how much pain he was from the how much pain he was in from the outside. But also, I understand how his story sort of highlights the cycle of abuse and what it can look like, and also just that like, I don't think that he is a bad person or trying to be a bad person, and I just hope that he gets the help that he deserves, right, to be better. Because there are some people who go out of their way with the intention of trying to abuse children, and I kind of don't think that that's what his, like, what he has set out to do, right? I don't think that he's someone who has set out to do that. I don't think that he wants to do that, whether he has done it or not, right? But the other person on set who was trying to help and trying to get in the way was also an adult, and this specifically highlights how you can try as hard as you want, and these people will still find their way into people's lives, and that would be with Drake Bell's father. His father recognized Brian Peck from a mile away, and he tried to protect him as best he could, and unfortunately, that man was so manipulative and preyed on so much of the weakness within the system and within the family dynamic that he had, that he was still able to abuse him. And it's so sad to think that you as a parent could try all that you want, and these people are still so manipulative to everyone around them, to the point that you may not even know it, because Drake's father didn't know it. He didn't know that it had happened to Drake for many years. And of course, finally, we have to talk about Jojo. And it may not be obvious, but what is Jessalyn doing? Because even though you may not say that Jessalyn specifically was or is abusing Jojo, and I don't think that she is necessarily, but she is putting her in such a vulnerable position, putting such a vulnerable individual in a vulnerable position, both to be taken advantage of by the systems at play. And I will commend her for being her, like, manager, essentially, and being very closely involved with her daughter, but it's almost to a point of, like, vicariously living through her that it makes her slightly less aware of the dangers, I think, that Jojo faces, in terms of this is how another cycle of abuse can look like, where you have someone like Abby Lee Miller coming in here and claiming that she's making people famous, and to put your child in a position to be verbally abused by this person, and then to, to be able to leave that situation, and then to also do that to other people, just shows me that, and especially the way that Jojo talks about her experience, shows me, for one, that Jessalyn and Abby Lee are kindred spirits, and two, that Jojo doesn't know any different. And I think that's why she's so delusional and so out of touch with things, is because she doesn't know any better. Why she is defending people constantly to try to remain on everybody's good side, trying to be that I would never say anything bad about anyone type of person, very much like trying to people please. And it's just really unfortunate, because I don't know if or when it will ever hit Jojo genuinely that she should be going to therapy for the abuse that she has faced throughout her whole life, of being taken advantage of by the adults who want to use her to sort of game the system in a way. And I say that in regard to putting your child out on social media, trying to get your child famous, to live vicariously through them and make them the breadwinner of your family, is so exploitative. And it's so harmful. And kids should be focused on building their own identity and being able to make mistakes. I talked about recently on my other channel, because my other channel just turned 10 years old here on YouTube. So I've been on here since I was a teenager, and had I been getting millions of views with hundreds and thousands of comments of feedback on me, I would have been a very, very different person, because while I did put myself out there a lot, I made some mistakes. Okay, I wore some bad outfits, had some bad hairstyles, and did some ugly makeup. And I was allowed to do that in the comfort of my own little bubble, where people could judge me or not judge me, and it was fine. And especially with a lot of these kids being able to criticize and face criticism so early on in their childhoods is definitely concerning. And my main point in making this video and talking about these three things is how uncomfortable I am with how many adults were involved and in the surrounding vicinities of these children, and are doing nothing to protect them, nothing to benefit these children in the best way possible. I'm not saying that there aren't adults who have tried. I'm not saying there are adults who don't care. But it's so unfortunate that people are so focused on their image, and that image means so much that they could literally end up homeless, which is super easy nowadays to be homeless, literally, that no one can say anything about anything anymore when it truly comes to protecting children. And of course, as I wrap this up, not only am I going to leave like some of my reference links, but I will also leave ways that you can help children, specifically through Thorn. They're a really amazing organization, and you should definitely check them out if you would like to donate and help them out, because it's so important to protect children. I think in many ways children are going to be traumatized in one way or another. I know that sounds bleak, but I had a really great childhood, and I still am trying to work through childhood trauma. And you may think, like, how are those two things, how can they exist at the same time? They can, okay? I grew up not knowing I was autistic, and there were a lot of traumatic experiences that I had simply because nobody knew that I was autistic. And it's no one's fault. There's no one to blame there. It just is, right? So sometimes you can face trauma and have a good life, right? But it doesn't mean you have to ignore it. It doesn't mean that you can't try to stop it from happening to some other child. It doesn't mean that we have to just give up, right? And I think especially in these three things happening at a very similar time, and taking into account each of these stories and how negatively impacted I think these children who were involved in every one of these stories is. One of them, I mean, it kind of went from like the worst thing that you can imagine to something that just seems so small, yet I think Jojo would be a very different person today if she didn't have a parent who was trying to make her the breadwinner of the family, trying to make her the center of attention of everything. And again, some kids are like that. Some kids want to be the center of attention, but it also makes you wonder, like, why that is, you know? Needless to say, I know this was a more serious episode. I know that this wasn't specifically about movies, but it was something that I had been thinking about for a long time, and they're all sort of connected in the sense that these children all were in the public eye and still were seemingly not able to help them. That's all I have for you guys. And with that, keep watching movies, and I'll see you guys in the next one.